For our next keynote, we have the pleasure of welcoming the Director of National Intelligence, the Honorable Avril Haines, for a discussion of how competitors of the U.S. are leveraging innovation, moderated by Ili Bayraktari, President and CEO of the Special Competitive Studies Project.
Hi, good morning, everybody. It's really an honor and pleasure to be here. I went to the school next door, and so it's always great to be here on campus. And thanks, Stephanie and the Carter family. It's always great to see Dr. Nye. Dr. Ellison was here earlier. But it's truly my distinguished pleasure to welcome Director Avril Haines with us here today. I know there's a lot of things going on around the world. North Korea launches, Russian invasion of Ukraine, events in the Middle East, just to name a few. And then, so thank you. I appreciate the trade-off for what you have done in being here with us and honor the legacy of late Secretary Carter. Director Haines, let me start by rolling back the tape a little bit. You went back to the government in January of 2021 after having a break of about 4 years when you served previously as a Deputy Director of CIA and the Deputy National Security Advisor. What was the world you saw in January of 21? How that was different compared to last time you were in government? We're going through elections now, so reflecting a little bit of your first day going in as a Director of National Intelligence.
Absolutely. Well, first of all, thank you so much for frankly inviting me and giving me the opportunity to get out of my office. And especially at this moment, I feel like we're all so tense, but it is truly, without question, a pleasure to be here, particularly to be able to honor Ash and to be with Stephanie and Eric Schmidt and others, and among others, Dr. Nye, who has been part of our community in addition to being iconic in academia on our issues. So there's so many different parts of the community that I feel like are here today and that are part of our world in Harvard and in the academic universe as well. And when I think about your question, I guess it's hard not to think about how challenging that first year was coming out of a pandemic in particular. I mean, it really defined so much of what we were doing in those moments, the way we were operating, how we were thinking about the world. But it was also, I think, another element of how national security has just been a definition that's been getting broader and broader over the years in so many different ways. And one of the first things that we were asked to do, for example, was to do an intelligence community assessment on the origins of COVID-19. And you know, one of the things that I know within the intelligence community we spend some time thinking about is exactly what's our role in the IC on these types of issues. We're used to working on essentially bioweapons and biosecurity issues associated with bioweapons, but it is increasingly been true that health and climate and economics and other aspects of our world are part of national security and in fact equivalent and fundamental to our work. And building out our institutions and our expertise and our knowledge in ways that allow us to be more effective in those areas was a part of it. Another was a sort of increasing and critical, I think, bipartisan consensus around the importance of strategic competition. That was, something that was so clear in the context of my own kind of confirmation hearing coming in 2021 that it was already building when I had left, but it really was at a different pitch, I would say, by the time I came in this context, and thinking about how it is that we postured ourselves for that. And another was really, and you've done so much work on this, but on the sort of technology development piece. I mean, I think the degree to which emerging technologies and disruptive technologies were a part of our world and increasingly important, and the sort of recognition that there were a whole series of innovations to come that could fundamentally change our way of operating in so many different ways and change the geopolitical landscape in different ways, and that we really were, in a sense, behind the curve on that and needed to sort of catch up in how we were approaching that really across the board, and we can get into that as useful in different spaces. And then the final thing maybe I'd mention would be, again, something that I feel like as long as I've been in government, even as a civil servant over decades, we have all had the talking points, I would say, of we need to improve our public-private partnerships. You know, this is just like a classic thing that every administration says, we talk about, and so on. I think when I came in 2021, the thing that I really saw was it was at a pitch of concern that it had never reached before, and the trend lines were all telling us how this was increasingly important to our capacity to do our work, and we were still in a position where we weren't able to engage and effectively partner as we needed to. And that is something that we've been spending a lot of time working on. We're still not where we need to be, but I think it has improved over time.
No, thank you.
Yeah.
That's let's fast forward now 3+ years. You've been in this job. You know, you have done a lot in terms of retooling and repurposing the IC mission from your role as the Director of National Intelligence. What are some of the big moves you think, if you look back the last 3 years, you have accomplished that will remain beyond, you know, next week's election?
It's like I've given you all of the problems, and now you're asking me, have I solved them? I have not. I will just freely admit that. But it's also, I mean, part of what I've experienced, at least, and it's maybe a feature of the institution that I lead. I lead the Office of the Director of National Intelligence. It is one of 18 elements in the intelligence community. You know, by statute.
Easy job.
Yeah, exactly. It's a big community, is what you learn. You know, our job is really pulling together essentially the intelligence across the community to ensure that the President, the National Security Council, the Homeland Security Council, warfighters, operators across the government have what they need, in effect, to make better decisions, and to try to ensure that there's sufficient coordination and integration across the community to manage the budget, in effect, for the National Intelligence Program that largely funds the community, and to really try to help the community come together to set a vision that allows us to be greater than the sum of our parts, in a sense, and be pulling together in a mutually reinforcing way towards a future, and do strategic long-term thinking about that, which is never easy in government. And that is sort of how I think about the role that I play. And as a consequence, anything that I've been a part of achieving has not really been me, to be completely honest. It has been working with the extraordinary colleagues that I have across the community who have had visions for what they wanted to do and to move forward on. And when you look at our national intelligence strategy, what you really see is the product of their collective thinking on what are the most important issues that we have moving forward that we need to invest in. And what you'll also see is that almost all of it is about the people, about the institutions, about promoting innovation, about interoperability, about how we can posture ourselves to meet what is a constantly changing landscape of what, you know, the national security threats and challenges are. And in all of those areas, I think we have made some progress collectively in different ways, and maybe to focus on a few of them. One is on this issue of partnering and on understanding better the role that non-state entities have in essentially our world today, and the importance of really revolutionizing the way we do business in the IC. That is something that across the community we have a consensus unanimity on, that this is something that needs to change. And we have, what we started to do was basically, we recognized that there was a problem, and I'll sort of go through the three aspects of it that we pulled out as being the most important. One was increasingly non-state entities, and a lot of them are multinational corporations, for example, but also sub-federal entities, states, cities, things like that. Transnational movements, academic institutions, research institutions, are having impact on the world in ways that affect the geopolitical landscape and affect national security, right? So, and this is true across the board. Like, so if you talk to our customers on climate, right, or on environmental issues, what they want to know is what do the major private sector companies think about these issues? How are they changing their own business practices? How are they thinking about their investments in other countries, other things like that? When you talk about the invasion by Russia of Ukraine, you know, obviously part of the response was sanctioning, And in fact, there were major oil services production companies and other private sector companies that self-sanctioned. And that made a big impact on the situation and, had relevance to our response and to ultimately the trajectory of things. So there's so many different aspects. The president hears about our analysis on the People's Republic of China and is interested in what the boardroom conversations are about investment in the PRC and how that relates to the economic trajectory of the PRC or other things like that. And so a big part of this is just better understanding the plans and intentions and the sort of trajectory of major actors, non-state entities, so to speak, and how that's going to affect the geopolitics. And that is something that we just traditionally in the intelligence community have not really focused on in the same way that we do state actors and proxies of state action. And so building that in from the ground up in a way that helps us understand that is part of it. The second is really about the fact that knowledge, skill, expertise that we need in the intelligence community, innovation, is often happening outside of the government. It is happening in the private sector, it's happening in research institutions, it's happening in other places. And we need to understand that, but we also recognize that, if you're at the top of your field in biotech, you're probably not going to come to the IC, right? So we need to be able to do partnership exchanges, we need to be able to access that talent and understanding in ways that allow us to build it into our understanding of the world, but also into our mission, into how we think about things and move forward on our operations and also on what the threats are of the future. And so that is another area where we recognize we have huge changes to make and come back to that. And the final area is just thinking about what is relevant to national security. In other words, we have long talked about the fact that the private sector is important to national security. We have talked about the fact that over 80% of our critical infrastructure is owned by the private sector, and therefore we need to make sure that that critical infrastructure is protected against cyber attacks, against other concerns, things like that. But now we're in strategic competition, and that means that there are sectors of the economy that are fundamental to our success moving forward as a society. And we need to help them protect their intellectual property, their expertise, their knowledge, all kinds of things along those spaces. And so recognizing that we need to have a different way of operating with them in order to be able to pursue that. And so we've done a lot of work, and you have been a part of this as you've advised us, frankly, and so have so many others, but on really thinking through how to make systemic changes so that it's not about the one person at one of our agencies who's really great at working with the private sector, but it's actually something that's incentivized and part of the normal sort of standard operating procedure so that we can actually engage more effectively, and also true for academia, for transnational organizations, other things like that.
Before we switch to AI and tech, when I look back in the last 3 years of sorry, Director Haynes.
Please, Avril is much better.
I think one of the things that you have done is, releasing the intelligence before the Russian invasion of Ukraine for the purpose of strategic effect. So can you maybe walk this audience through the decision to do it, because it entailed probably risk and benefits, ultimately the president's decision to release it, because I think that is a new era in which you have introduced the role and the mission of the intelligence community.
Yeah. So I will definitely walk you through the story because I think it is kind of interesting and it helps to reveal this. But the one thing I'd say at the front end of this is something that makes me think of Secretary Carter, which is part of the story is substantive, but a lot of the story is also organizational. In other words, it's really about bringing the two things together in a way that allowed us to be more effective, and I'll try to pull that out as we go through it. So we obviously were receiving a lot of information, intelligence, that indicated that essentially Putin was considering the possibility of a large-scale invasion in Ukraine. That's kind of how I would say it started in a way. And as we pulled this together and tried to understand it and provided analysis from, our experts in these areas, the policy community, which was the first, stop, in a sense, within our government, right, was pretty skeptical. They were like, really? Like, why does that make sense? You know, I can imagine a small-scale invasion. I can imagine him coming into the East. I can see how he's using his military to sort of bully and to ultimately try to affect decision-making in this area, to deter, to promote interests in the context of the Normandy process, other things. But that was the first place. And so we went through a process of trying to help, you know, explain. Here's why we think this is true. This is sort of the analysis that we're getting. We walked through it to the point where the policy community and the president himself said, okay, we need to start talking about this to our allies and partners because we need to have a response if this happens, right? And moreover, if we can take action now to deter it from occurring, that's important too, right? And so let's start discussing this. So sent out as Secretary of State, Tony, you know, Secretary of Defense, the National Security Advisor, Lloyd, Jake, everybody goes out and starts discussing this with first allies and partners and so on. And they come back, and I remember sort of a moment where they're talking about it, and they're like, they're really skeptical. They really don't think this is gonna happen. And, you know, this is sort of the discussion. And the president turns and says, you have got to get out there. We have got to get this intelligence out there. You've got to share it with the intelligence services of these partners and allies and so on so that they can see what we're seeing, so that they can help their policymakers understand why it's at least worth planning for, in a sense. And so we said, okay, great, we'll do this, right? And I think we're in a moment right now, you know, which again has been developing like so many of the trends that I've talked about for so long, but where we all recognize how working with partners and allies is absolutely critical to every national security challenge that we face today, right? And certainly President Biden perceives it as such, and it's part of the national security strategy, and this is something that we're working. And working through organizations like NATO and the EU, which were sort of the main organizations that would ultimately be able to coordinate and launch action by a whole series of countries, both from a military perspective, but also from a sanctioning perspective and export controls and other things, right, were critical. And that means sharing information at scale, right? And basically there were a number of things that we learned in the process of trying to do this. One was that it was much better to share this with a kind of a multi-IC perspective. So what I mean by that is that you've got the military analysts in the room, you've got the folks who are thinking about the economics, you've got the political analysts in the room, you've got a variety of different folks who are understanding and seeing this from different perspectives, and you're pulling all of that together, including pulling together the kinds of intelligence that we collect and exploit, essentially, and providing a comprehensive picture. And that was much more effective, right, than sort of the one-off conversations that you might otherwise have, is really bringing that expertise to the table and doing that. The second piece was that it was a dynamic conversation. In other words, things were happening. So sometimes it was about how many more tanks are on the border of Ukraine, right? But it was also about, is Russia engaging in an information operation in certain areas, and what does that look like, and what does that portend about plans and intentions, right? Or, you know, different aspects of the landscape that mattered to this overall picture. And so really pulling that together and then constantly pushing out information meant that we had to do this at a scale that was larger than we would typically do, working through our embassies, our posts, right, to sort of get things out, and through our stations, essentially, to work with intelligence community partners. And then what we would see was this sort of virtuous cycle whereby we would share information, we would first then learn something from other countries who are also looking at these issues and enrich our own perspective on these questions. We would then bring that back in so we could help our policymakers understand how other countries were seeing this. We would then also see that the conversation changed for the policymaker going into X country, you know, who would have like, okay, we understand that you see it this way. Our intel community is saying we have a slightly different view of it. Here's sort of where there's a difference. And then our policymakers would come back, like Tony or the president or others, and say, well, so this is the thing that they're hung up on. And we'd say, okay, well, let's see what we've got on that, and then we could have the conversation about that piece. But at the same time, we wanted to make sure that we were seen as separate from the policy community, because that is a part of what, frankly, gives us credibility in these spaces. And so we had to make sure that the analysts felt comfortable. They're just calling their shots as they see them. They're pushing forward information. But obviously, the policy community can give us topics and say, this is an issue where they are concerned or they don't understand why you see it that way. Can you explain that? And that really helped to create this thing. And what it's led to is us really trying to think about how we can do that in a way that is effectively setting the table for key policy conversations, but also in moments of crisis, giving us more options essentially across the table, and then doing it in a way that allows us to protect our sources and methods. And that last piece is obviously fundamental, because if we are exposing things and losing the sources, then we are not going to be very effective at our job. It is absolutely crucial that we maintain that. And what we learned is that through the sort of, frankly, team mentality that we brought to it across the IC, we were able to share things in ways that allowed us to say, okay, well, your information is less risky, in a sense, to be disclosed, right? It's still telling the same story, but from another perspective. So let's use that as the basis for doing a downgrade or like helping others to see another part of it. We also used, as you saw, a lot of commercial imagery where it's basically, you know, we're seeing things and we tip and cue, and effectively then commercial imagery is able to see it, and it's unclassified and it can be shared in a way that allows for people to see things. But it was a really fascinating experience, and I think, you know, it's not going to be the same in every piece. We learned a lot of lessons. We can do it better in different spaces. It's not the answer for everything, that is for sure. And, you know, I think Bill says, like, as in Washington, anything that's worth doing is worth overdoing, is sort of the Washington style. We need to not do that. So we have to be careful about how we approach this. But it is, I think, a tool that we can continue to use. And it's also not new. I just want to be clear about the fact that over the course of my career, I've seen how intel diplomacy has been useful. It's just that it's rare that it's so public and, frankly, so done at such scale on some level. And I think that was sort of a fascinating aspect of this.
I agree. Let's switch a little bit on AI. A little over after you took over DNI, ChatGPT happened. And I think we have never seen a technology taking over Washington so suddenly. On the policy side, on the technology side,
Yeah.
I mean, the last a year and a half, probably, we've had the longest White House EO in the history that I remember, at least. And then last week, the administration released the National Security Memorandum on AI. Can you just a little bit walk us through how was it the first time you maybe tried it, or somebody showed you these large language models and what they can do? And then as you were thinking how you can use it for the intelligence purposes.
It's very intimidating being asked this question by you. I am.
Okay,
I'm gonna, like, I mean, I think. So there's so many different aspects of that technological development and large language models and what we've been seeing that are of relevance, obviously, to our work. And on one side, trying to get a handle on what it meant for society was actually a really challenging piece of business. Like, and I have to say, so, you know, one of the things that our policy customers will ask us, right, is, so what does this mean for the future? What kind of disruptions is this likely to occur, you know, to create? And how can we both plan better to address those things, but also how can we take advantage of opportunities that may be presented? And one of the things I always feel is a challenge for us in the IC is that we're always looking at the negative aspects of technology. You know, we are very focused on the threats that they present, but we also have to be mindful of the opportunities that they can create, and trying to understand the societal impact. And I will say that one of the things we did, and it fit to the three sort of categories of issues that I'll describe, was to take a team of folks that included analysts, but also others, as I'll describe for the other issues, to go around to start talking to the companies and to people who understood what this technology might mean and how it might develop, in order to better understand what the strategic implications were for us in these spaces, and to try to begin to build that into our analysis and our work. So that was one piece. The second piece was obviously how do we take advantage of this for mission, right? Like, so how do we think through developing it in a way that allows us to, you know, do our jobs more effectively? And how do we counter against some of the potential challenges that it may ultimately result in, whether it be in the context of information operations or cybersecurity or biosecurity or military application, like so many different pieces to that we needed to understand. And how do we balance those two, and how do we ensure that we're promoting the right investments in the community to do that? And I would say that this is an area where I think it's particularly challenging because it is so expensive in many respects. And for large language models, we're obviously not going to be on the cutting edge. The private sector is on the cutting edge. We're looking to try to understand it, understand how we can use it, and how we can develop it. And one asset that we have that I think is special is our data, because we have a lot of data that is either not necessarily publicly available, but also data that we very carefully exercise tradecraft on in order to establish its quality, its credibility, things like that, that ultimately may be of use in these types of things. But we also have a lot of rules and issues that we need to ensure that we're adapting in this kind of scenario so that we're protecting privacy and civil liberties and other issues, and that we're compliant with the law. And if you go down that road too far and you're not paying attention to those things, you can ultimately put yourself in a situation where you delegitimize essentially our capacity to do the work that we think is useful in these spaces. But also we want to be thoughtful and have attention to these questions. So being another very important aspect of this, and working on the data issues that allow us to take advantage of the data in the intelligence community to do mission or otherwise to counter, was another fundamental aspect of the things that we recognized we had to quickly get our heads around. A final piece of this, also not surprising to anybody here, I'm sure, is just the number of policy questions that we were getting about how we compared to China, how we compared to other adversaries, what were the different sort of potential ways in which we might measure that, how might we manage that, what would that competitive edge mean to other countries' capacities, and so on. And finally, related in a sense to all of these things, was thinking through the fact that in many respects, AI, I think as a general matter, but the large language models are another example of this, so much of what it's capable of doing is enhancing our capacity in different ways at a rate that is so much faster than we expect, right? And as a consequence, a big part of the challenge for us in the intelligence community is forecasting where the strategic surprise is going to occur, right, for the critical breakthrough in design in X that really makes a huge difference in our world. And that is just a fascinating but very challenging question to answer in this moment, and thinking through the strategic indicators that would allow us to even have a shot at sort of helping people to see how that was likely to develop was a critical aspect. How do you want to grade my answer? You should tell me what did I miss?
I know we're close to the end, but I wanted to ask you a different question. We are here at the university campus. There are a lot of young people, prospective, future IC analysts, or you've served our country for more than 20 years, Avril, and I appreciate that. I think everybody here owes you a debt of gratitude and for your tireless work. But why would people still go and work for the IC? Why is it still cool to be, part of the intelligence community?
Okay, I'm obviously biased, but it is the best job ever, honestly. Like, it's an amazing place to work, and I will give you some sense of why I believe that to be true. For me, there are a number of things that I've realized over the course of my life are critically important to sort of why I like doing a job and why I am, engaged for as many hours as all of us work in these spaces. One is, honestly, this sense that you're always learning makes me feel more alive. And in the intelligence community, you are always learning. It is extraordinary, the different topics and expertise and knowledge that have to be brought to bear to understand the world. And what you get to be is part of a community that has people that are leading experts in a whole range of things, but also a good reason to go to leading experts who are outside of the community to ask them hard questions and to try to figure things out. And that is, it's so rewarding intellectually in so many different ways, and I think that's a critical aspect of why I've enjoyed working in the IC. Another, and I think many people who talk about their government service reflect on this, and I too, I went out of government for 4 years and I came back again. And when people would ask what I missed the most, it was the people. The people are extraordinary. And you don't join the IC if you're interested in fame and fortune, obviously. But you do it because you're interested in doing something that matters, because you're intellectually inspired by the mission, because you think that this is something that deserves your time and effort. And it is, it's an extraordinary group of people from so many different walks of life. And part of what I also love about the IC is how many different walks of life. I mean, I think diversity is our strength in the IC. I think that the fact that we all see things from so many different perspectives, cultures, ethnicities, everything across the board, racial, it's our experiences, our knowledge, we bring this all to the table, and being an independent thinker is part of what makes you good in the IC and respected and loved and appreciated. And it is so important to be able to surface disagreements and different thinking and different ways of approaching things so that you can actually think of those out-of-the-box solutions to things that ultimately, nobody's ever thought of, but that actually helps you solve a particular problem. And so the people, the intellectual thing. Another is that, honestly, and I found this when I went into government, as a younger person, is that you get to do things that you really have no business doing. In other words, because it's honestly like it's an all hands on deck kind of situation, and so suddenly you're doing something that, you're responsible for the position of the United States on X, and you think, well, how did that happen? And it is, that part is great because it helps you see what it means to take on the mantle of responsibility in these moments. And it's such a privilege. It is such a privilege and honor to be able to do something that you think might make things a little bit better in your society or your community as you move forward. And I feel like that is so critical to everything that we do in these spaces, and it's why also your ethics, your morals, if you see us do things wrong, which undoubtedly you do, all of us have that feeling like, please join the IC and make us better, right? I mean, this is the message that I really want to share with you, because we want people who bring their ethics, their morality, their values, their ideas about how to make a better society in the IC to help us be better and to see those challenges and to actually help to address them. It is crucial, and we need a culture that allows us to do that and that really enhances our ethical approach to these issues. It is a place that Ash was well loved in the IC as an independent thinker, as somebody who really tried to move the ball on so many different things, and an extraordinary mentor to so many of us in different spaces. But really, thank you so much.
Thank you, Avril. Thank you for your service and everything. Please join me in thanking Director Haynes.